In the following video, a Desmi service engineer will take you through a full overhaul of a Desmi HD 101 Rotan gear pump in bare shaft design. For the overhaul, we use a genuine Desmi spare parts kit. We'll go through the overhaul step by disassembling the pump, replacing all gaskets, sealing units and bearings, and completing the overhaul by reassembling the pump. When servicing and overhauling a Desmi pump, we recommend that you always study the manual before starting. The manual and spare parts kit are available at www.desmi.com/aftersales. Make sure you have the necessary tools and the spare parts kit at hand. All the parts needed are included in the spare parts kit. And on the rear side, an item list for all parts is shown. A list of the pumps which are covered by the spare parts kit is also included. On the rear side, a QR code is shown. When scanning the code, enter the www.desmi.com/aftersales section where manuals, overhaul videos, spare parts kits, etc. are publicized. Using Desmi Genuine Spare Parts Kit makes it easy and convenient and trouble-free for you to overhaul your Desmi pumps. Loosen the set screws in the front cover. Be aware of the position of the front cover. Fit the set screws into the extraction holes in the front cover. Use the bolts as extraction bolts to pull out the front cover. Remove the front cover. Remove the old gasket and clean surfaces properly. Unpack the gasket from the spare parts kit and fit the new gasket to front cover. Be aware not to destroy the gasket as it's fragile. Fit the front cover, making sure it's in the correct position. Tighten the set screws in the front cover. Remove the bypass valve from the pump housing to renew the gasket. Loosen the set screws. Disassemble the bypass valve from the pump housing. Remove the old gasket and clean surfaces properly. Unpack the gasket from the spare parts kit. Fit the new gasket onto the pump housing and mount the bypass valve onto it. Be sure the valve is pointing in the direction of the suction side. Tighten the set screws. Remove the guards. Turn the complete pump. Loosen and remove the rear set screws attached to the pump housing. And remove the pump unit from the pump housing. Loosen the adjusting screws from the bearing covers and remove the bearing covers from the bearing bracket. Be aware of the position of the bearing bracket. Loosen the set screws from the bearing bracket attached to the rear cover and remove the bearing bracket. Open the lock ring and remove the bearing nut and lock ring. Remove the rear bearing from the shaft. And remove the bearing cover. Now also remove the bearing cover attached to the rear cover by loosening the set screws. Clean the shaft. Pull out the shaft from the main bearing. Punch out the main bearing. Push out the stationary part of the mechanical shaft seal from the rear cover. Replace the spring pin if corroded. Clean the shaft seal cover and check the seat for flatness and cracks. It's important to ensure that all parts are properly cleaned. Remove the old gasket from the rear cover. Exchange the rotating part of the mechanical shaft seal, but before disassembling the sealing unit, be aware of the distance between the rotor and shaft seal, if there is any distance. Remove the rotating part of the mechanical shaft seal from the shaft by loosening 2 Allen screws. Clean the shaft properly. Unpack the new mechanical shaft seal from the spare parts kit and fit the rotating part to the shaft. Now make sure that the distance between the rotor and shaft seal is correct and tighten the 2 Allen screws. Lubricate the O-ring and shaft and insert the rotating seal part. Clean the seal surfaces thoroughly. Now install the stationary part of the mechanical shaft seal in the rear cover using soap or soapy water on the O-ring. Ensure the correct position of the stationary seat referring to the pin and the slide in the stationary seat. Press the stationary part of the mechanical shaft seal in the rear cover down firmly. Clean the surfaces of the stationary seat properly. Install the rotor into the pump housing. Fit the new gasket to the rear cover. Attach the rear cover to the pump housing, but be careful not to damage the stationary seat in the rear cover when fitting the rear cover to the pump housing. Tighten the set screws. Unpack the main bearing from the spare parts kit and fit it to the shaft by punching it into the rear cover. The bearing has to be mounted approximately 1 to 1.5 millimeters below the surface of the rear cover. Mount the main bearing cover and tighten the set screws. Insert the inner bearing cover before mounting the bearing. Mount the bearing onto the shaft. Make sure it's punched to the shoulder of the shaft. Insert the lock ring followed by the bearing nut. To prevent the shaft from rotating when tightening the bearing nut, lock the rotator. It's important that the tool used for this operation is made of a soft material such as brass or an equivalent material. Lock the bearing nut with the lock ring. Fit the bearing bracket to the rear cover. Be aware of the position of the bearing bracket before tightening the set screws. Install the other bearing cover loosely using the adjusting set screws. Now reinstall the inner bearing cover loosely to the bearing bracket. The rotor is now in full contact with the front cover. To adjust the gap, use the adjusting screws in the rear bearing covers to move the shaft forward or backwards into the correct position according to figure 43 in the manual. To ensure the correct axial clearance, use the air gap gauge. After adjusting, make sure to properly tighten the screws on both sides. Mount the guards, and the overhaul is complete.